Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our conversation, Understanding Latinx AO Diversity and Why It Matters. Pleased that here at University of Hartford, we take time out to celebrate and recognize different heritage. And this month, as you know, between September 15th to October 15th, across the United States, we celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. It's a time for us here at University of Hartford to honor the identities, the histories, the cultures, and contributions made by Hispanic and Latinx AO Americans. Again, we encourage everyone across our campus to continue their own learning and understanding of the Latinx AO cultures and identity. Information and resources will be posted at the DE&I site that will provide you with some information along with your own identified resources. Without any further ado, I just want to also invite you to our upcoming event that will be held, program held on October 21st. Again, as we all know, the pandemic has highlighted the drastic response. And again, mental health has been one of those highlighted outtakes of COVID-19. And I'm pleased to share that we're going to have a conversation with a group of social workers, psychologists, and leaders in this field. So please join us as we continue to work to ensure that especially our students enjoy success and that we properly, again, serve our students here on campus. Thank you, Lisa. I'm very pleased to introduce our facilitator this afternoon, Dr. Marcela Cuellar. Dr. Cuellar is Associate Professor in the School of Education at the University of California, Davis. Her research examines higher education access and equity with a focus on Latinx AO student experiences and outcomes at Hispanic-Serving Institutions, campus climate, and community college baccalaureates. Her scholarship has been published in the American Journal of Education, Community College Review of Higher Education, and Teachers College Record. Dr. Cuellar holds a BA in psychology and Spanish from Stanford University, an MA in higher education leadership from the University of San Diego, and a doctorate in education from the University of California, Los Angeles. I am so pleased to have her here with us. It's afternoon here and it's morning there. So if you hear her say good morning, we're going to cut her some slacks. Welcome to University of Hartford.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Christine Grant. I want to thank your office, the Office of Diversity and Community Engagement, this invitation, and it was great. I got a phone call from Christine, referring a blog that I had written about 2 years ago, and this was the impetus of starting this conversation, of this invitation to join you this afternoon. So I want to thank you, first of all, Christine, for reading that blog. Sometimes when I write things, I'm like, is somebody reading this? And hopefully it is helping individuals think more deeply about their practice. And so that made me really honored that you found it interesting enough to invite me here this afternoon with you all. And I also want to thank Lisa Cote for helping me get prepared for my time with you today and for making sure that we have a seamless presentation. So as Christine and I were talking in preparation for this conversation today, we did want to keep this as a conversation as much as possible. And so I'm hoping that I only speak for about 35 minutes, so that then we can really have a conversation together and I can engage with you and we can have more of a dialogue as part of this presentation. So this talk today I've titled, in the same ways that I've titled the blog that I wrote, Understanding Latinx Diversity and Why It Matters. And so I will mention that I just say Latinx but it really is encompassing when I write it, the A and the O, and I'll actually discuss that a little bit about how we think about how we name this group, because that is a conversation that often comes up and one that has been evolving and part of major headlines in the last few years about how we think about this group, including I see a lot of not newspaper, but magazine articles, social media articles about what does this X mean? So we'll talk a little bit about that, or I want that to be part of our conversation. And part of the reason why I want to start off with a little bit of context. So what do we know about Latinx students in higher education? Sorry, I think the slides thing is not working, or can we go back one slide? Thank you. Okay, so I might have to just ask you, Lisa, to help me progress on the slides if that's okay. So just to provide a little bit of a national snapshot of the importance, or why I think it's important for us to start to think about the diversity in the Latinx community as was being described in even the definition of Hispanic Heritage Month. It really is a celebration of the multiple cultures and heritages that are part of this pan-ethnic group, right? It is a group comprised of many different groups that have similar histories in relationship to the United States with regards to colonization, regards to immigration, and so on and so forth. However, there's a lot of nuances and complexities within this large pan-ethnic group. And so those are some of the things that we'll discuss today and how those matter for higher education specifically, and some of the experiences that some of our Latinx college students may encounter. So first, we know that there has been an increase in the number of Latinx students pursuing higher education, which is a great thing. With the most recent figures from fall 2019 show us that approximately 36% of all Latinx students that are in that traditional quote unquote age group that is in college, the 18 to 24 age group, 36% of Latinx students are enrolled in a higher education all over the United States. And this represents an increase from 2010 when the figure was only 32%. Now, this is also prior to COVID. We know that the Latinx community has been disproportionately impacted by COVID, and that has impacted some of those enrollment patterns into higher education. So these figures will look different once we have a full snapshot of this time period. But prior to COVID, we have been experiencing an increased representation of Latinx students in higher education. However, while this is a great thing, we've also seen that the equity gaps persist when we compare those enrollment rates to the overall enrollment rates. So compared this 36% compared to the overall enrollment rates to 41% shows that there's still a gap. Latinx students in this age group are still, fewer of them are enrolling in higher education than the overall population of students in this age group. So those gaps persist even though we've been closing them. So this really remains a concern for us to continue to think about how this pan-ethnic group in comparison to other groups is equitably or not equitably pursuing higher education. Now, once we talk about students being enrolled, we also have to think about, well, what does access is not the only thing that matters. Are students being served by these institutions? Are they achieving their goals of education? And we see there that some of these disparities also persist. On average, 54% of all Latinx college students graduate in 6 years, compared to 60% overall of all college students. So again, we see that there's equity gaps at the access point, but there's also equity gaps at the completion point. Now, while those gaps or comparisons by racial groups matter because they point to those inequities and ways that we need to enhance our institutions to be more inclusive, to achieve greater equity, at the same time, we know that this Latinx community in itself is diverse, but we often don't kind of take that next level to think about, well, how are those very diverse perspectives or diverse experiences impacting access, but also their experiences. And so those are some of the things that I want us to think about, because as this group is very diverse, and as we see a greater representation in higher education, I really feel this is the next level of work that we need to think about, is how do we understand this very, what can be diverse Latinx group, and understand how there may be inequities within this group in order for us to really enhance or reduce those equity gaps in comparison to other groups. So just to give you a snapshot of what I mean by that, and then we'll definitely discuss that throughout this afternoon, is when we look at that 36% of Latinx students enrolled in post-secondary institutions, there's actually inequities within the Latinx community. So if you look at the chart on the left with these ethnic subgroups so that comprise this pan-ethnic group, we see that 58% of Venezuelan and Colombian students age 18 to 24 are pursuing higher education or are enrolled in higher education, which is significantly higher when we compare that to other groups within this community. So when we look at on the other end, only 27% of Guatemalan and Honduran students in this age group are pursuing higher education. So even within this group, we see inequities, and then a variation in between 46% of Cubans, 33% of Mexican, Puerto Rican, and also Salvadoran students, and then 41% of Dominican students are pursuing higher education. So we see variability in terms of the subgroup and how many are pursuing higher education. So this starts to prompt questions, well, what can we do to ensure greater equity even within this group? So some of these numbers are more in line with each other. Now, we also know broadly overall, we've seen an underrepresentation of males in color, of males, but particularly males of color. And these hold true for the enrollment patterns of Latinos and compared to Latinas. We know that 33% of males in this 18 to 24 age group are enrolling in higher education compared to 40% of females. So we see some inequities there as well. And there has been a greater conversation in higher education about how do we address the unique needs of these different groups, males and females. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But this just starts to paint a picture that there are some inequities within this group in itself, on top of the inequities that we see in comparison to other racial groups. So this is the kind of diverse experiences, inequitable experiences that I feel we need to start to think about more deeply, and what that means for what we may be able to do in higher education to more effectively and intentionally support Latinx students. So next slide. So first, I think it's important to think about even this terminology, Hispanic or Latinx. We use these terms often very interchangeably, and we know that individuals use these terms interchangeably. And so I just wanted to provide a very, very brief definition that kind of shows some of the nuances in the differences of these pan-ethnic terms that cover or that students may self-identify with. So a broad definition of Hispanic is really referencing individuals who are coming from Spanish-speaking countries. So it's very much like a language-based definition. And so this would include any Spanish speaker, including those from Spain. What this excludes, though, in terms of Latin America, are certain individuals who come from non-Spanish speaking South American countries. So this includes Brazil, French Guiana, Suriname. So thinking about this term, it includes some individuals, but then it excludes others that we may consider part of this group. And this term was used, or really has come from not adopted from within the community, but really from the federal government developed this term as a way to start to capture and count the number of individuals within the country who fit this definition. And so this was used in the limited versions of the 1970 census, but then adopted since then in subsequent versions. Now, with the term Latino, Latina, Latinx, this broadly refers to more of a geographical definition of really indicating that it's individuals who come from Central and South American countries, as well as individuals in the Caribbean and Mexico. So this, again, is in contrast to Hispanic, which is more of a language-based definition. And so this would include anyone from these geographic regions, but this would not include individuals from Spain necessarily. And so this was a term that first appeared in the 2000 census and has been used interchangeably to refer to this pan-ethnic group, these individuals from these very different communities, but with very similar experiences, again, in a lot of ways in relationship to the United States when we think about colonization and immigration. So the next slide. So this slide here provides a little bit of context. So we have these two terms, and I mentioned that they're often used interchangeably to refer to this group. And I think that that's a good thing that I saw that they were being used together to describe Hispanic or Latino Heritage Month, because individuals may prefer one term or another. It really varies by geographic region and also by a variety of other social identities that are embedded within the Latinx community. So here, I just want to highlight a few. I know there's a lot going on in these graphics, so I'll just kind of focus on each of them individually. But these here represent national trends from the Pew Research Center. And I do want to mention, this is usually a really good resource for statistics on the Latinx community, whether that be as a whole across with national trends, or they often have a certain focused research that is more about college students and understanding Latinx college students as well. So this here represents their most recent data that they just put out actually earlier this month in line with Hispanic Heritage Month to talk about, well, how is it that individuals self-identify as Hispanic or Latinx? And one of the things that they find is that immigrant generation matters for whether individuals even self-identify as part of this group. So we see here on the very left-hand side is that individuals that are foreign born or second generation, meaning that their parents were born in another country, but they were born here, indicates that about 92 to 97%, so the overwhelming majority, do self-identify as Hispanic. Now, when we start to get to those students who are children of immigrants, the third generation, we start to see that number start to decline. It's only about 77%. But once we get to that fourth generation or higher, it's only 50-50 if individuals self-identify as Hispanic or Latino. So that those individuals may start to identify more as American and not necessarily by this ethnic origin because it's so many generations removed for them. Now, when we look at this middle slide, we see how individuals differ on whether they use their country of heritage as how they identify. So again, if they identify as Mexican, Salvadoran, Puerto Rican, Dominican, we see that 47% of individuals identify by that country of heritage. Another 40% approximately identify by the broader pan-ethnic term of Hispanic or Latino, and then 14% as American. So again, we see a variability in terms of how individuals are choosing to identify. When we think of, do you prefer Hispanic or Latino? Here again, we see variability. Some individuals, the majority, actually have no preference. Either one of those terms suffices for them to self-identify. However, others have some preferences, 27% with Hispanic and 18% Latino. So this provides really a general overview of really how terminology can be fluid or how individuals may identify with certain terms over others. And so I think that's important to think about, that certain terms may feel more in line with how people self-identify. Now, when we start to think about the term Latino, which has been the general term, pan-ethnic term used, in recent years, we've seen a pushback as we've started to think more about gender inclusivity and gender identity. One thing about the Spanish language, similar to Romance languages in general, is that they're very gendered. And so the O is a masculine version of this term. And so this is where individuals who have not self-identified on the binary of female or male have really pushed back to say, well, where do we fit into this language or into this identifier that is very much gendered? So this is where we see the emergence of Latinx, which has really been over the last few years. And this has largely been a term that has become popular on many college campuses. We see it in student organizations using it, a lot of social media, and that's kind of been the larger adoption of this term that's kind of happened. However, that has not necessarily been the case across this community overall in the United States. And so the last graphic here points to that. When we think of the term Latinx, the majority have never heard of it. Those individuals who are part of the Hispanic or Latinx community have never heard of this term. 20% don't use it, and only 3% use this term. So it's really thinking about, well, what terms do individuals use? And so here I want to point to some of the work by Dr. Cristobal Salinas at Florida Atlantic University, who has done a lot of work to explore, well, what are the origins of this Latinx term? What does it mean? How do students identify with it, and how do they not identify it? I do see that a question or a hand was raised. Do we want to, I'm happy to take questions along the way, so we do keep it as a conversation, or what is your preference here, or Christine?
You can go ahead if you're okay with answering a question.
Sure.
Is there a question, Lisa?
I thought I saw a raised hand. Or we can wait till the end. So maybe I'll continue to the end. All right, thank you. Sorry about that. So this term Latinx can be very complex because what we also find, this research that Dr. Cristobal Salinas has been developing, is that also college students do not all ascribe or self-identify as Latinx. And he's also really pushed us to think more complexly about how we use this term, given that it did emerge by individuals who do not self-identify on that binary of male or female. So by broadly adopting this term to refer to everyone, we almost negate or render those individuals invisible again, because now everyone becomes Latinx. So that is part of the reason why I use the X/A/O, because some individuals do identify, or where their gender and race very much intersect. So for instance, myself, I self-identify as Latina. Really at that, my gender and my racialized identity are very much central to who I am, but I myself am not, I'm not on the binary. So for me, that term should be reserved for individuals who do self-identify in the non-binary. And so students are thinking about this in complex ways. So I want us to think about that. How do we think of these terms and terminologies? And I think that Dr. Salinas's research really points to the complexity of this term and making sure that we are understanding the origins of this term and not just adopting it, and then rendering those individuals for who this is their identity then becomes invisible. So we can go to the next slide. So this is one of the things that Dr. Salinas, and there's a reference here for this reading, that talks more about the history of the term Latinx, where the use of this X comes from, to really prompt us to think about, how do we understand this term and how do we think about how we use this term? And so one of the things that Dr. Salinas is proposing is that we actually think about the various identities that our students may hold. So in his research, he found that some students did not self-identify as Latinx and actually resisted the use of the X because they saw this as a US-based concept that doesn't necessarily translate the same in the Spanish language. And so some of his participants said, actually, I use other terms like Latine or Latinu, which is much more in line with the language of their country of origin, or how that might come up more, and also as a form of resistance to this X that doesn't quite translate the same way in Spanish. So he is proposing that we think about using Latin with this asterisk as kind of a way to think about the complexity of identities, or the ways that students who are part of this group may self-identify, that intersects with gender, or that takes into account their countries of origins and how language may more naturally fit with the use of this term. So I do recommend this article because it covers this in much greater detail and also provides much more nuanced definitions of each of these terms in this particular chapter that he has. But he is pushing us to think of this, because really thinking about using this asterisk as a way for us to take a pause, to really think about the fluidity of identities that students may hold within this community that are along the lines of gender, race, and country of origin, and how that might impact how students self-identify. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So one of the things so we're starting to get a sense. Oh, and thank you so much, Lisa, for putting a blog that I also wanted to share as a resource. But there's this blog on a podcast called Black, Brown, and Bilingue, which has a conversation with Dr. Salinas talking about the complexity of the use of the X, and also how these podcasters, their own perceptions of this or resistance to this idea of this X, and that being an identity that's being ascribed to them, even if they don't self-identify in that way. So I think it really points these complexities and makes us think about, okay, how do we best refer to this group of students, given that these identities can be more fluid and terminology is constantly evolving also about how we refer to this group. So one of the things that I wanted to also highlight is that the college environment itself can influence how our Latinx students self-identify. And so one of the things that we know is that given the diversity in our institutions across the United States, there are certain characteristics within the environments in colleges that can also influence the ways that students may self-identify. And so this may be things like the size of an institution, the composition of that institution based on racial and socioeconomic composition. Also, are students largely living on campus? Are they commuting from home? What are the different communities that they're engaging with? And also their engagement in different student organizations. And this comes from a book written by Daisy Verduzco Reyes, here's the link to this book, about learning to be Latino and how college shapes identity politics. And so through this ethnography of 3 different colleges and universities, Dr. Reyes uncovers how, depending on the environmental or culture, the environment and the culture that students in a college encounter, that may shift the ways that they self-identify. And so what we mean by that is that some students in some campuses may encounter microaggressions, or more microaggressions. They may encounter more culture shock, in an environment that may be very different from their home communities. Or some students may really see no discernible differences in their experiences on their college campus to their home community, especially if they're commuting to a college that is within their home community. There may really not be a lot of difference that they see from their college experiences. So kind of taking all of this into account, what Dr. Reyes found was that students in these 3 different colleges that she studied, one was a liberal arts small private college, one was a large public research one university, and one was a regional public university, found that the students actually that were part of these organizations that she studied identified differently. For those students that were in institutions where they were more of a minoritized group, meaning that they were only 11% of students on that college campus, they actually chose to identify pan-ethnically as Hispanic or Latino, largely in reflecting that they were still a minoritized group. And so in solidarity, they could self-identify more easily as this pan-ethnic group. But some students also, depending on what organizations they were involved in, if they were involved in more of a political organization, then that's where some of them chose to identify by their ethnic origin. So for instance, Chicano in this particular case, if they were politically involved in certain organizations, that identity may be the identity that they identify. But for those students who were at the regional public university, they were actually self-identifying by their national origins or their country of heritage. And that was more salient for them because there was a plurality of Latinx students on their campus. And so for them, this identity of Latino overall was not necessarily as salient, but really more so their country of origin. What we also know is that for Latinx students on college campuses, is that less privileged identities are particularly salient for them. So for those Latinx students who self-identify as female, lower income, those that are LGBTIQ, and even those who come from countries that may not be the majority in a particular region. So for instance, Central American may not be as largely represented as other communities because this is a smaller, less privileged group. That becomes a very salient identity for them, no matter which college campus they're on. And so thinking about this salience of identity matters. Now, other research also talks about that students, especially students who in this case are Central American, have a repertoire of identities, both identifying pan-ethnically in certain spaces when there is a need to feel solidarity or be in solidarity in spaces where there might be microaggressions against Latinx students in general, so where there's common experiences, but also where they may intentionally self-identify as Central American to not be rendered invisible, that this is an identity that matters to them and is part of a core part of their identity. So in some spaces, that identity may be something that's very important to them, and it's usually not to be rendered invisible when there's this assumption that they may be part of another ethnic group. So I think this idea starts to complicate that context matter when we think about how students self-identify. So the next slide. So what this starts to get to is we have seen more research over the last few years start to think about what possible inequities may exist within the Latinx community. And some of the things that we've started to learn is that there are some ethnic differences within the subgroup in terms of the types of enrollment decisions that students make, types of institutions that they may enroll in. So for instance, we see that Central and South American students are more likely to enroll in four-year institutions compared to their peers. And that may align with some of those initial patterns that we saw about the number of students pursuing higher education. We also know that some of that Central American students, in comparison to their Mexican American counterparts, are more likely to enroll in institutions that are HSIs or emerging HSIs. And so this starts to raise questions about, well, how are we outreaching and recruiting, for students if we know that we have this diverse representation of students. We also know that immigrant generation status may also influence the college decisions that students are making, with first generation Latin immigrants being less likely to enroll at four-year HSIs, and while second immigrant generations are more likely to enroll at two-year HSIs. So just starting to think about that complexity may matter with ways that we think about outreaching to these communities. We also know that the experiences and outcomes of Latinx students may differ depending on ethnic background. So this is where some of my research has started to show some of this complexity. So for instance, when we think about microaggressions, one study in particular that I recently published indicates that, or there was a participant who mentioned this kind of idea of being rendered invisible. A student who self-identified as Guatemalan in a campus that was largely comprised of Mexican and Mexican-American students felt like she needed to assert that I'm not Mexican, don't just assume that I am. I don't want to be invisible in this space. My Guatemalan identity is a big part of who I am, and it's exhausting to have to let people know or convey that I'm also here. So I think thinking about that some of these assumptions can make students feel invisible and feel like they have to really educate others, where we can maybe think about how can we make sure that we are being inclusive about the various students who may be part of our communities. What we've also started to see is that when we look at the intersection of race and ethnicity, because again, Latinx students, in terms of the census and the ways that were reported, were not considered a racial group, we're considered an ethnic group. But when we start to think about the ways that students may self-identify in different ways, so for those students who may identify as both Latinx, but also another group, there we start to see some nuances. And what I mean by this is that for students who self-identify as only Latinx, they demonstrate in one study that I'm thinking of specifically, they demonstrate a certain pattern in terms of their commitment to create change in society. Overall, those students show a certain level of growth. Now, when we parse out those individuals who identify as Latinx and white, they show less growth on that particular variable. However, when we look at those students who self-identify as both Latinx, but another minoritized racial group, whether that be Black or Asian or Native American, we see a similar pattern to those individuals who only self-identify as a Latinx subgroup. So I think what this starts to indicate is that we need to think about the intersection of race and ethnicity for this group. We can't just assume that that experience is the same, because we know that related to that, there's differences in phenotype, in how students may present to others. People may not assume that they are Latinx, or where others may actually, that may be part of what individuals see, and that may affect how students are experiencing their environments. And we also see that students' self-perceptions also differ by ethnicity and gender. And so here I'm also pointing to another study where I found that when we look overall within the Latinx group, that females in particular show less growth in their self-perceptions of their academic abilities in comparison to males. So even though Latinas may be more represented on our college campuses, they may not be necessarily having the same equitable or empowering experiences. And so I think that raises a question about how do we make sure that we are providing the kind of experiences that are advancing the success of students more broadly. And then we also know that there are variations in degree attainment by ethnicity and institutional characteristics that I think are important for us to tease out. So I think this is just starting to lay this idea that understanding these nuances start to point to possible inequities that we should start thinking about how we may address in order to enhance success for the diverse experiences of Latinx students on our college campuses. So next slide. So I will just cover these next two slides really quickly, because I'm being mindful of time and I want to make sure that we are able to answer questions. So I think moving forward, it's important for us to start to think about on our college campuses, are we disaggregating our data to further explore possible inequities that may exist in this Latinx community that we just haven't really considered before? And I know that there's a lot of limitations to some of the data collection. Sometimes we may not gather this information about students' ethnicities. And so maybe we want to start thinking about how can we gather that more intentionally. Now, one way that we can do, if we do gather this data, can we think about how we may start already disaggregating that data to start looking for some of these experiences? And so I think it's important to think about, again, that intersection of race and ethnicity. Should we start thinking about not only are there differences by different subgroups, but might there also be differences by students who self-identify multiracially Latinx? So here I'm thinking about the experiences of our Afro-Latinx students. Might their experiences, even within the umbrella group of Latinx, also differ? And how can we better support students who are at the intersection of these identities? And then to also explore the intersection of multiple identities, including gender, sexual orientation, and disabilities, and how that may also disproportionately impact the experiences of Latinx students within this group. Now, this is assuming that we have some of these data available, but if we don't have this data, then I would encourage institutions to think about, well, what are the ways that we can intentionally collect more data that will allow us to examine some of these possible intersectional identities and how those may be connected to certain inequities within this larger subgroup. And so that if we do think about collecting this data, that we may think about the different categories. So using the different terms, Hispanic, Latinx, or ethnic categories to explore that more deeply, or also providing students with an open-ended option for them to tell us how they self-identify and not prescribe that for them necessarily. Again, thinking of the work by Dr. Salinas that indicates that students self-identify in multiple ways. So this is just something to think about. Next slide. And then what do we do with this data? It isn't just enough to gather this data, right? So really using this data to think about what practices or what things we may need to do within our campus to make sure that students are feeling included, that we are moving towards greater equity and inclusivity on our college campuses. And so I think that this then moves to say, how do we begin to address those intersectional needs that may be within the Latinx community on our college campuses, and how can we best support those students? And here I'll share resources from Excelencia in Education, which is a national advocacy organization focused on the success of Latinx students. And they have a wonderful database where they've gathered information of different programs on college campuses that are enhancing Latinx success. And I think some of the programs on their website highlight some of the ways that different colleges are thinking about the different needs of Latinx communities on their college campuses, knowing that these look different on college campus. So I just want to highlight two of them really quickly. One of them is that I think some college campuses are thinking intentionally about how are we building the linguistic assets that are among some of our Latinx students. And first, I want to mention that I think it's important to first recognize the linguistic diversity among Latinx students. While Spanish may be one of the primary languages if students do speak more than one language, Spanish may be one of those languages, but it's not the only language that some of our students may speak, especially when we think about Latinx students who are coming from indigenous communities in their country of origin. They may be speaking indigenous languages that add to this repertoire of languages that exist in our community. Some students may be English learners, and so some colleges have developed programs to more intentionally support those students that are English learners. However, we also have some students who are have strong bilingual skills in speaking Spanish in this particular case. And so some colleges and universities have intentionally started to think about, well, how do we enhance those skills, knowing that those skills can actually support students as they move into the workforce and move in their professional career. So how can we think about these assets that students have, and how can we better support them moving forward? And then lastly, I'll just mention that some campuses and really nationally have started to really think about in terms of gender as being one of those major intersectionalities where we have seen such disproportionate enrollment and completion rates comparing males and females. And so we have seen that many institutions have started to think about, well, how do we create spaces for our male and female students in order to support them more intentionally? And so in my blog, for instance, I mentioned on our campus, at our Center for Chicanx and Latinx Academic Student Success, there are courses that have been created that are spaces for Latinas and Latinos to, in community with each other in their own groups, talk about how their identities and their experiences are unique and how they can support each other in advancing in their educational trajectories. And we also see examples from other campuses where they've thought about how can we support Latinas to come to college, and then they've created these partnerships between in the development of a mother-daughter program at ASU, for instance, or at the University of Texas, we see Project Males, which has created a national network of ways that we can think about the experiences of males of color intentionally and better support them so that we can achieve greater equity. So with that, those are just some of the things that I wanted to cover. And so I spoke a little bit longer than I wanted, so my apologies about that, but I do want to be able to engage in a conversation with you all about your thoughts or questions on some of these ideas.
We do have one question in the Q&A. So one of our professors says, part of what I'm hearing is the need for safe spaces. And so I'm wondering what colleges what can colleges do / create / envision in their campuses to welcome Latinx students?
That is a great question. So I think there's a variety of things that we see on many college campuses, and I can speak a little bit about what we've done on our campus in the last few years, since that is something that I've seen so more closely. But for instance, our Center for Chicanx and Latinx Academic Student Success didn't exist 5 years ago. It's only been in existence in 5 years. So I think that's one thing that we can do, is think about, well, where are those spaces? And if those spaces don't exist, how might we create those spaces? And those spaces may look different on each college campus. But on our campus, given the large enrollment of Latinx students in the last 10 years, we really felt that this was a strategy across the university that we needed to be more intentional about our retention efforts and think about the identities that students hold and how we may need to provide a space for students. And so that has been one thing that we've done. And so the center, while it is a hub, that is one place that students may go, but I feel that in that as well, our center has thought about, well, how do we make sure that our students are connected to other parts of the center as well, or of the university? And so I think that this is where courses, even offering courses within the center, have supported some of those efforts. So I think centers are one way. I think also thinking about the importance of ethnic studies. Do we have ethnic studies courses that we can let students know we have these spaces where you can learn about your culture and heritage? And I think also as well, making sure that faculty, which are the first point of contact in the classroom for students, that we're also equipping them with different tools about how to make their classrooms more inclusive and supportive. And it can be very really from small things like students indicating like there is an earnest, genuine effort from faculty to get to know me, to make me feel like they see me. So I think those are just some of the things that pop up right away. But I think that this idea as well about envisioning, right, that we maybe have a goal to achieve or moving forward. So again, here's where I can speak a little bit about what we've done on our campus. We've been thinking about what does it mean for us to be a Hispanic-serving institution? We've kind of been on the cusp of this for quite some time and not haven't made that definition yet in terms of the number, but we have shifted our thinking to say, well, how can we be better serving for our students, regardless of if we're meeting that definition or not, given that 23% of our students are Latinx. And so one of the things that we've done is created a strategic plan, right? Thinking about, well, where do we need to remove inequities? What are some of the barriers that we may already be seeing just with existing data where we know those barriers are and what are some things that we can try to address those inequities. So I think having a vision of where we're going is always helpful, and then thinking about how we can achieve that. But also, having conversations about these things openly and making sure that they remain central to the conversations that we're having moving forward.
Thank you. We also got another question. Someone would like to know what constitutes a microaggression?
It's a great question. So I think many different components or different things can comprise microaggressions. This can be something as simple as assumptions that folks may make. And so I think a common one that we think of is when comments may be made that, for instance, like a common one is when we hear individuals say, certain assumptions are made about an individual given their background. So I mean, and I can speak personally here because this is one that I've definitely experienced myself. So the notion that someone might say, oh, you speak Spanish or you speak English so well, that there's assumptions behind that being made about why I may not speak English so well, and that those are tied to ideas that we have or conceptions, whether those be stereotypes about individuals. So, when those stereotypes become apparent and students hear them, when assumptions are being made, I think also, as I was mentioning earlier, the experience of this young woman, the assumption that everyone made that this young woman was, in this particular case, assumed she was Mexican. And for her, that just really was an incorrect assumption, and that this was something that really made her feel not included, right? To say I'm not being seen, or who I am is not being seen and honored. But jokes can also be microaggressions, or students being intentionally excluded, even if it's not explicitly stated. So those feelings of exclusion that may be slights, or when somebody is being followed in spaces on campus, being surveilled because there might be assumptions that they may be doing something incorrectly. And these are experiences that we know a lot of our Latinx students, a lot of our African-American students encounter on our college campuses, being made to feel unwelcome without, some of those may be verbal, but some of those may be just gestures or things that students can feel by the ways that they're being surveilled on campus. And also, sorry, go ahead, Lisa.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to mention that these are also often the hardest things to kind of put our finger on, right? Because these become everyday things that students may encounter in their life and on our college campuses. So even the reporting of these microaggressions may not be, we may not even have a full handle of them. And, one of the things that I would also argue is that some of these microaggressions are so common for students that they don't even, when it happens, they may not even, they just take it as like, that's just part of life. Or they've already learned how to navigate that and try to see past that. But I would argue that's still not okay, right? Like, we still should be thinking about how can we remove some of those experiences so that they can focus on what they're here for, which is an education and to thrive.
Professor Cuellar, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. And I just wanted to unmute because it's too much to type in the question in A, but I wanted to follow up on this concept of microaggression and sort of put the thought out there that professors contribute to both the safe space and the microaggressions that students experience as well. And so kind of link those two together in the sense that I think schools really need to invest more in attracting professors like Latinx professors to their campus, but also there needs to be a sense of sort of making sure that professors don't microaggress their students. I mean, I have had a lot of students who tell me, like, as soon as a professor is uncomfortable bringing up something about sort of like an ethnic group, like they shut down the conversations. And it could be something about like dreamers or undocumented, or like something they're just not aware of. And like the immediate response is like, this isn't something we're going to talk about in class. And part of it is because they don't know themselves, but the students feel that they're not being recognized because of that sort of response. So I'm wondering if you could talk about what role do we play as, you know, professors, and also like the institutions can play to attract people who could lead those conversations.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Karen. And I agree with you, right? Faculty, again, I feel are like the first point of contact for many students. So we can either create that welcoming environment, or what I would even say an empowering environment, or we can create a very, what can be hostile or just a negative experience for students. And so I think one of the things that we do need to think about is, how do we think about that when we're hiring individuals, right? So do individuals have they shown the ways that they have worked with students who may come from different backgrounds from even them? Do they know how to advise students, mentor students? You know, what kind of background do they come with that? And also, what I would say in terms for our, if we're aiming to recruit Latinx faculty, how are we ensuring that not only we're recruiting them, but then how are we going to say that we're going to support those Latinx faculty? Because those faculty themselves may experience those microaggressions on their college campus as they're trying to support students. So thinking about that. But I think even once faculty are on campus, how are we thinking about the professional development of faculty, right? So I think even sometimes not even being aware that maybe some things that we're doing are actually microaggressions, right? And that can be, sometimes we don't know what we don't know, right? So I think the part that you're raising, Karen, about like shutting down conversations that we may not be comfortable having, how do we equip faculty to be able to be more comfortable with that? Or if they're not comfortable with that, because it also can do damage, right? If we start engaging in a conversation that we might not be comfortable with, how do we refer students to those places on campus where we can have those conversations, but also tooling faculty to the extent that we can, right? To support them to have those conversations, and knowing that faculty come with their own skills, right? Everyone's starting at a different point about where you can enter those conversations. And so how are we keeping our own learning progressing? Does that answer a little bit, Karen?
Absolutely, Professor. Thank you so much. You touched on a lot of things. Thank you.
I think we have one final comment / question in the Q&A. So this person said, I loved how you talked about the trend of Americans with immigrant Hispanic ancestry and how that declines through generations, which is something I've been struggling with myself as a third generation. Could you maybe talk more about how to combat this feeling of being disconnected from your ancestry, and how outside people can make assumptions and view your ethnicity as not Hispanic, or will be surprised when you begin to talk about it? I feel like this is a big stigma and I'm not sure how to address it. Thank you.
I think that this question raised to just a microaggression in of itself, right? The assumptions that may be made. And I think that this is the part where I would say that these microaggressions can come from, outside of the Latinx community, but there also are very much microaggressions within the Latinx community, right? Whether that be based on race, gender, or assumptions made about even things like identity or language, right? I think language is a very complicating factor in our community. So for instance, assumptions that we might make about faculty. So for instance, I have a good friend and colleague of mine who is Latina also very similar, or maybe similar, I'm not, but has in our conversations, doesn't speak Spanish. This is fourth generation, but very much still identifies as Latina. But on her campus, there's assumptions that she's shared before of like, folks automatically think that I'm a first generation college student and I'm not. And so I've had to kind of educate others to say, hey, not everyone fits, these categorizations. And so I think part of it is that's part of, unfortunately, often falls on individuals to educate others, right? To say we can't make assumptions about anyone really, right? Because there's so many intersecting identities. We can't assume that individuals will self-identify as Latino even to begin with, or Hispanic, knowing that there's variability in that, understanding what may be salient to them, but also, so I think moving more, this is more of a call to us as a society, to not put that on individuals to have to combat that, right? Because that too in itself can be a microaggression of like, oh, here I have to explain again, right? Like why this is problematic. But how do we move to really think of, there's not a monolithic Latinx community. And I think especially more and more, I think about this more and more as we have now more than a generation of Latinos who have been college educated and their children are now in college. And those experiences are also probably very different from those students who are first generation coming to college. So we can't paint anything with like an overall stroke and assume that's everyone's experience. We need to really think more intentionally about the nuances and intersectionalities. And I think that is both the case with students as much as it is for faculty. And so how do we do a better job educating ourselves and making sure that we disrupt those microaggressions when they happen?
Thank you so much for those answers, and thank you to everyone who asked questions. I believe we have gone a little bit past the end of our time in such a great conversation. Chris, did you want to wrap it up?
Just want to thank again Professor Cuellar for a great presentation and for taking time out to be with us. We will share with you the resources that Dr. Cuellar has shared with us, and we look forward to seeing you on October 21st as we look at the Latinx community and mental health and managing the repercussions of COVID-19, especially our students here on campus, faculty and staff. Again, the last page here has a listing of our upcoming programming within this space. And again, thank you for joining us. Your response and our evaluations will be really appreciated. And again, have a great weekend. And thank you, Professor Cuellar.
Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone.
Have a wonderful weekend.